Greetings, abstraction students. Happy Friday. I hope this greeting finds you well. And I've had a great time reading your first discussion prompt responses for our time together. It was great to get back into following your thinking as you're thinking with the topic, wrestling with, struggling with the readings, and I know they're very difficult, and it's difficult for a philosophy specialist to work through those readings that I gave you. But I wanted just to give you a taste of it, to give you a sense that what we're looking at with abstract art is not merely a product of art history or a certain stylistic development, but that it's a particular kind of cultural practice that emerges from and in response to the Enlightenment, modernity, and the values and the orientations of really what is characteristic of modernity. And that is the autonomy of subjectivity, the individual's the authority and the autonomy of the individual's particular view and experience of the world. Now, they can use different resources and different tools to affirm and to rely upon that individuality, that subjectivity. For Descartes and the Enlightenment philosophers, it's reason. For Kant, it's reason with this intuitive, constructive, in many ways creative jump. That Kant's insight is that what truth is, what reality is, cannot exclude the human subject as the knowing knower, or the thinking thinker, or the one that is doing the work. And so one subjectivity is bound up with the use of reason. And just as one subjectivity is bound up with the representation of the observable world in paint. And so if the subject is involved in it somehow, if the subject's perspective is somehow to be considered, and you could say that the history of modern philosophy is working that out. What does that mean? What is the relationship of a truth in the world that exists outside of myself and my own inner consciousness? How do they relate? And how do they connect and interact? And how do I know how my consciousness offers an accurate representation of the world, or that my consciousness is somehow similar to your consciousness? But viewed in this way, then, Alberti's theory of painting, in which linear perspective, the mathematical principles of linear perspective, are used to carve out a picture space within which the viewer is observing a drama taking place on this flat surface that opens up as a picture window, is not that much different from Kant's philosophy, Hegel's philosophy of self-consciousness and the spirit, and even abstract art, or the orientation towards abstract art, of the distortions and the unconventional approaches to the landscape or the human figure that we see in Cézanne or in Van Gogh. That it's not just what is being represented out there in the exterior observable world, but it's my experience of it. It's how I see it. And not only how I see it, but how I feel it. And so this picture window, this notion of perspective, linear perspective implies a singular point of view. It's this point of view, not that point of view. It's standing here in front of the painting, not standing in another place on the floor. My perspective, if I'm standing as a teacher in front of a classroom, if I'm standing in front of the classroom, my perspective on the students is predicated upon where I am standing. The question is, where am I standing? Am I standing on objective ground that everybody stands on and everybody assumes? Or is where I stand, my perspective, distinct for me? My perspective. So, is Van Gogh's Starry Night a representation of stars as any person would experience them and see them? Or the representation of the stars as they are? Which, of course, is impossible, because what we experience and what we see empirically as stars don't exist anymore, or they don't exist in the same way. They are manifestations of time. And so what we see, the visible world itself, is deceptive. The star is the shining, the twinkling we see is they're not hung up there. And so the question is, what is reality? What is that star's truth or reality? Is it discoverable by astronomy? Is it discoverable by going out and looking at it? And so when Van Gogh is painting the Starry Night, he's painting that night, that landscape, that nighttime landscape with those stars as he not just sees them, but as he feels them and experiences them. His subjectivity is inextricably related to it. And that's something in our experience, our daily experience, we know. How we experience the day, the sunrise, the sunset, as pleasing or terrifying or riddling us with anxiety or giving us hope, has to do not with the inherent qualities of the sunrise and the sunset, but in our experience of it, in our consciousness, our mindset, our emotional apparatus. And what's interesting is that Alberti, by focusing on the individual in terms of the artist's capacity to create this illusion and the presence of the painting that makes sense for a person that stands before it, is that it's giving credence to that individual experience, whether that experience is a rational experience or emotional experience. And so abstract art is bound up with this exploration of representation. What does it mean to represent the world? What does it mean to represent the human body? Does representing the human body mean that you represent it according to the idealizations and the dictates of classical antiquity, of classical antique sculpture? So David painting the death of Socrates. Socrates' naked torso is a representation of, adaptation of, quotation of the Apollo Belvedere. It's not a representation of Socrates' torso. It's a representation of another work of art that we read as Socrates' torso. Or compare that to a female nude painted by Gustave Courbet, whose conservative critics railed against the fact that they were too obviously representations not idealized, and so they didn't conform to the ideals of classical Greek and Roman sculpture, but they represented the fact that these women were late or middle 19th century Parisian workers and peasants with their individuality, their wide hips, their fleshy thighs, What is more real? And it's very difficult for us. We will see the visual arts, we will see pictorial representation as a depiction of reality, and how we think about reality is very unnuanced. It's conventional. A person who draws may be able to draw the likeness of a rose, but has anybody who sits in front of a rose and looks at it for hours and hours and explores it? How do you represent the reality of that rose? Is it just representing a likeness? Or is it something else? Can you represent that rose that can somehow give a sense of its symbolic value, or what it smells like, or its emotional response to the beloved who receives it, or to the beloved who gives it? For the development of abstraction doesn't emerge. We don't have Malevich's white on white or black square that just emerge out of nothing. They are developments. They're developments from various gradations of abstraction, in which moving outside the conventions of classical art as it was taught as a set of skills. That academic art is a sum total of particular professional techniques and skills that you were taught and that you were expected to master. Artistic practice operating outside that, what we will call, which becomes then the development of modern art, doesn't have those. But that doesn't mean that the painting isn't skillful. Whether it's a Cezanne painting or a Jackson Pollock painting, you can't devote thousands of hours to applying paint on canvas and not develop skills and begin to learn how paint and color interact on a canvas. They are certain techniques that are learned. They're different techniques. But what's important to know is that from representation, we have various degrees leading to abstraction. Cezanne's paintings, in comparison to Malevich's white on white or black square, are representational. But Cezanne's figures, compared to David's figures, or even Courbet's figures, or Monet's figures, are abstract. And perhaps more accurately, with Malevich's paintings, Mondrian's paintings, you could call them non-objective art. They don't have a subject. Cezanne has a subject, the female nude or the male nude or a landscape, but its relationship to what it represents is pushed and stressed. But for Malevich and Mondrian, that representation to observable reality is cut. Pollock strip paintings too. The cord that ties representation of visible, observable world is cut, which was believed by the practitioners to open it up, to open painting up. And one way to be thinking, and abstraction is always, that abstract entity, that abstract orientation is always lurking behind how we're experiencing paintings. We think great painting is Leonardo's Mona Lisa, or Raphael's School of Athens, or David's classical figures. And we just have lurking in the back of our minds that Cezanne just Cezanne's figures are clunky and awkward, and they're just not, they're not good. But as I would say, I mean, Cezanne's paintings aren't intended to participate in that framework. He's not trying to paint like David and Raphael. And Malevich's Black Square is not trying to pull the wool over our eyes and paint a joke. He's trying to make painting operate in a different emotional register. And in fact, what he wants is to be able to liberate the spirit and to activate the consciousness of the individual who stands before them, modeling them on Byzantine icons, the Russian icons that he was so familiar with. And how do the faithful who utilize icons in their religious practice utilize them? They don't stand before them in a gallery scratching their chin and theorizing about them. They prostrate themselves before them. They touch them. They kiss them. There is something sacred about them. That is the relationship that Malevich wanted and hoped to achieve by starting over with painting, boiling it down to its basic structure of color and form. Also, with representation, a representation of a female nude, for example, or let's just, a representation of a sunrise, has an effect on us because we've seen and experienced sunrises, right? So we recall it. But the aspiration, the increased aspiration of the abstract artist is to create an experience in the paint with the painting that doesn't rely upon another experience outside of that. That it is its own unique aesthetic phenomenon. That doesn't need the aesthetic phenomenon, the recollection of the aesthetic experience of the sunrise or the male or the female nude or the vase of sunflowers, but that it has its own integrity as an aesthetic experience. And what is pretty amazing is that it's not just for many of these abstract artists, particularly for artists like Malevich and Mondrian, that this way of changing, this increase towards abstraction, these radical changes in pictorial representation somehow related to the potential for radical change, for radical social and political change. So that if say, classical and Rococo French painting was a manifestation of a particular order of the church and the state, okay, the altar and the crown, what would happen if the paintings took the lead and began to shift and change? Would that represent, would it serve as a catalyst for changing how we understood the church and the state, social organization? Instead of being the follower of social organization, could painting and other creative practices be a catalytic means of change, of social and political change? That is the theory of the avant-garde. That is the theory within which paintings like Mondrian and Malevich are operating. Hope these thoughts are helpful to you. I wish you a strong finish of your week and a restful weekend, and look for my week 3 email to you on Monday. I'll be traveling to freezing cold New York City to spend my first week teaching in New York with my King's College students. So I apologize if I'm a little wonky in getting back to you for those that have questions. But I hope these thoughts are helpful.